Hey guys, tonight we begin with a side of you might not have known too much about. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is a field somewhere in America, perhaps in Ohio, perhaps in Pennsylvania, where the grass grows a little differently. Not greener, not lusher, but somehow heavier with memory. The earth beneath holds secrets that seep upward like morning dew, carrying with it the weight of 100 years of dreams deferred, promises broken, and truths buried beneath the thunderous applause of Saturday afternoons and Sunday cathedrals. This is the story of American football, not the version painted in gold and crimson on stadium walls, not the mythology of heroic touchdowns, last-second victories that we've learned to recite like prayers. This is the other story, the one that lives in the shadows cast by stadium lights, in the whispered conversations behind closed doors, in the ledgers kept by men whose names history has chosen to forget or remember for all the wrong reasons. I want to take you there, to that shadowed place where the game we love reveals its most human face, scarred, flawed, beautiful in its imperfection, terrible in its capacity for both transcendence and corruption. We'll walk slowly through these memories, these moments when the sport that promised to embody American virtue instead reflected our deepest contradictions, our most persistent demons. The air is thick with possibility and regret as we begin this journey together. Can you feel it? The way the past seems to press against the present, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be understood. This is not a condemnation. It is something closer to a meditation, a reckoning with the complexity of loving something that has, time and again, broken our hearts while simultaneously filling them to bursting. In the beginning there was mud, thick, clinging mud that turned white uniforms brown and made gods of ordinary men simply because they were willing to throw themselves into it again and again until the whistle released them from their beautiful torment. The year was 1869, and what we now call football was still finding its shape, still discovering what it wanted to become. But even then, in those earliest days when the rules were fluid and the stakes seemed innocent, the seeds of corruption were already taking root in the fertile soil of American ambition. Rutgers and Princeton faced each other on a field in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and while history remembers this as the first college football game, it forgets to mention the small bets placed on the sidelines, the quiet agreements between students who understood that where there is competition, there will always be those who seek to tip the scales in their favor. The game was primitive then, more resembling soccer than the intricate chess match football would eventually become. But there was something in the collision of bodies, something in the primal satisfaction of advancing territory through pure will and strategy, that spoke to the American soul in ways that would prove both glorious and dangerous. We were a nation built on the idea that anything could be conquered through determination and cunning. Football became the perfect metaphor for this belief, and the perfect vehicle for testing its limits. As the sport evolved through the 1870s and 1880s, so too did the sophistication of those who would exploit it. The introduction of the forward pass in 1906, legalized in response to President Theodore Roosevelt's demand that the game become less deadly, opened new possibilities for strategy and deception. But it also created new opportunities for those who understood that information was power, that knowing what play would be called next was worth more than all the athletic ability in the world. The coaches of this era were not yet the tactical geniuses we celebrate today. They were often little more than glorified disciplinarians, men who had played the game themselves and believed that victory came through superior conditioning and unwavering moral fiber. But even among these early apostles of football virtue, there were those who whispered in dark corners about the advantages that could be gained through less honorable means. Consider Walter Camp, the man we now call the father of American football. His innovations, the line of scrimmage, the system of downs, the standardization of field dimensions, gave structure to what had been chaos. But Camp was also a businessman, a man who understood that spectacle sells tickets and that tickets fund empires. When he advocated for changes to make the game more exciting, more suitable for mass consumption, was he motivated purely by a desire to improve the sport? Or did he recognize, even then, that football's future lay not in amateur purity, but in professional entertainment? The answer, like so many truths about football, exists in the space between noble intention and pragmatic calculation. Camp genuinely loved the game and believed in its capacity to build character in young men. But he also saw an opportunity to create something larger than sport, a cultural institution that would generate wealth and influence for those positioned to control it. This duality, this tension between idealism and opportunism, would define football's relationship with corruption for the next century and beyond. By the 1890s, the game had begun to organize itself into conferences and formal competitions. With organization came rules, and with rules came those who sought to circumvent them. The amateur ideal that governed college athletics was already straining under the pressure of increased public interest and financial opportunity. Schools began offering inducements to talented players, jobs that required little work, academic accommodations that bordered on fraud, cash payments disguised as expense reimbursements. These early corruptions seem quaint now, almost innocent in their transparency. A player might receive free room and board, or his tuition might be mysteriously covered by an anonymous benefactor who happened to be a devoted alumnus with a passion for victory. Compared to the sophisticated schemes that would follow, these violations of amateur principles were like children playing at crime. But they established precedents, created pathways that would eventually become superhighways of corruption. The Spanish-American War of 1898 provided an unexpected window into football's growing influence on American culture. Many of the young officers who distinguished themselves in Cuba and the Philippines were former college football players, and the press was quick to draw connections between gridiron success and military leadership. Football, they suggested, was preparing American men for the challenges of an expanding empire. The game was no longer merely entertainment. It was national preparation, character development, a vital component of American strength. This elevation of football's cultural significance had profound implications for its susceptibility to corruption. When something becomes essential to national identity, the stakes of controlling it multiply exponentially. Football was no longer just about which school had the better team. It was about which region, which class, which vision of American masculinity would dominate the cultural landscape. The pressure to win, always present in competitive sport, became magnified by these larger symbolic meanings. The turn of the century found football poised on the edge of transformation. The game that had begun as a rough approximation of rugby, played by college boys, was evolving into something uniquely American, something that embodied both our greatest aspirations and our most persistent weaknesses. The shadows were growing longer, and in their darkness, new forms of corruption were beginning to stir. The year 1905 arrived like a reckoning, heavy with the weight of accumulated sins. 18 young men had died playing football that season, their names carved into tombstones instead of trophy cases, their promise extinguished on fields that had promised glory but delivered only grief. The game that was supposed to build character had instead broken bodies with a systematic brutality that even a nation accustomed to industrial accidents found difficult to stomach. But it was not just the death toll that troubled the national conscience. It was the whispered stories of what happened in those final, fatal moments. Games where players were deliberately targeted for injury, where victory was pursued through tactics that made mockery of sportsmanship. The flying wedge, a formation where players locked arms and charged like a human battering ram, had turned football into a form of ritualized warfare where casualties were not accidental but inevitable. President Theodore Roosevelt, that apostle of the strenuous life, found himself in an impossible position. He believed deeply in the virtues that football was supposed to instill: courage, determination, the willingness to endure hardship for a greater cause. But he could not ignore the mounting evidence that the game had become a machine for manufacturing martyrs rather than men. In a series of White House meetings with coaches and administrators, Roosevelt delivered an ultimatum: reform the game or watch it be banned entirely. The response to Roosevelt's challenge revealed the first clear glimpse of football's capacity for elaborate deception. The newly formed Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States, which would later become the NCAA, promised sweeping reforms designed to eliminate the game's most dangerous elements. The forward pass would be legalized to open up play and reduce the emphasis on brute force collisions. The neutral zone at the line of scrimmage would prevent the mass formations that had proven so deadly. New rules would govern player eligibility and coaching conduct. But even as these reforms were being implemented with great fanfare, a different kind of corruption was taking root. The same administrators who proclaimed their commitment to amateur ideals and player safety were quietly developing more sophisticated methods of circumventing their own rules. If players could no longer be recruited with crude bribes, they would be attracted with academic opportunities that existed only on paper. If coaching could no longer rely solely on physical brutality, it would instead emphasize psychological manipulation and strategic deception. The legalization of the forward pass, in particular, created new opportunities for what we might charitably call creative interpretation of the rules. Early football had been a game of transparent simplicity. You ran at your opponent until one of you could no longer continue. The forward pass introduced elements of timing, deception, and misdirection that would prove fertile ground for more subtle forms of cheating. Coaches began developing elaborate systems of signals and coded communications that pushed the boundaries of what constituted fair play. Consider the case of Amos Alonzo Stagg, the legendary coach at the University of Chicago. Stagg was celebrated as one of football's great innovators and moral exemplars, a man who refused to play games on Sundays and demanded the highest standards of conduct from his players. But Stagg was also a master of psychological warfare, who understood that victory could be achieved through means that were technically legal but ethically questionable. Stagg's teams were famous for their complex systems of audibles and hot routes that allowed them to adapt their offense based on defensive alignments. But these same systems also provided cover for more questionable practices. Players could receive instructions from the sidelines through seemingly innocent hand signals. plays could be changed at the line of scrimmage based on information obtained through questionable means. The line between tactical innovation and strategic cheating became increasingly difficult to discern. The 1910s saw the emergence of what historians would later recognize as football's first great corruption scandal, though it was barely acknowledged as such at the time. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching began conducting an investigation into recruiting practices in college athletics, and their findings painted a picture of systematic rule-breaking that extended far beyond isolated incidents of player payments. Schools were maintaining elaborate networks of alumni boosters who provided jobs to promising athletes that required no actual work. Academic records were being altered to maintain player eligibility. Coaches were receiving under-the-table payments that doubled or tripled their official salaries. The amateur ideal that was supposed to distinguish college football from professional sport existed primarily in mission statements and public rhetoric rather than actual practice. But perhaps most troubling was the discovery that these corrupt practices were not random violations committed by rogue actors. They were systematic programs coordinated at the highest levels of university administration. Presidents and trustees who publicly championed academic integrity were privately authorizing expenditures that made mockery of their stated principles. The corruption was not a departure from institutional values. It was an expression of them. The Carnegie Report, when it was finally published in 1929, should have triggered a reformation in college athletics. Instead, it was largely ignored by the press and dismissed by university officials as the work of idealistic outsiders who failed to understand the practical realities of competitive sport. The report's detailed documentation of corrupt practices became a blueprint for more sophisticated forms of rule-breaking rather than a catalyst for reform. World War I provided a temporary respite from these growing tensions, as colleges suspended their athletic programs and young men turned their attention to more literal forms of combat. But the war also accelerated changes in American society that would make football's corruption problems even more intractable. The expansion of mass media, the growth of disposable income among the middle class, and the increasing mobility of the population created new audiences for college football and new sources of revenue for those who controlled it. When the sport resumed after the war, it returned with an intensity and scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. Stadiums that had once held thousands were expanded to accommodate tens of thousands. Radio broadcasts brought games into homes across the nation, creating new forms of fandom and new opportunities for those who understood how to monetize emotional investment. The stakes of winning and losing were no longer confined to campus bragging rights. They had become matters of regional pride and significant financial consequence. This transformation coincided with a broader shift in American culture toward what we might call organized innocence, the systematic cultivation of nostalgic narratives that obscured complex realities beneath layers of sentimental mythology. Football became a perfect vehicle for this cultural project, offering stories of clean-cut young men learning life lessons through honest competition while generating enormous profits for institutions that presented themselves as non-profit educational enterprises. The corruption that flourished in this environment was different from the crude rule-breaking of earlier eras. It was more sophisticated, better disguised, and more thoroughly integrated into the institutional structures that governed the sport. Players were no longer simply paid. They were provided with comprehensive support systems that met their every need while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of the arrangement. Coaches were no longer just tactical innovators. They were CEOs of complex organizations that generated millions in revenue while operating under the fiction of amateur competition. By the end of the 1920s, college football had become a massive commercial enterprise that maintained its legitimacy through elaborate performances of educational mission and amateur purity. The corruption was so systematic and so thoroughly normalized that it had become invisible to those who benefited from it. Like a toxin that accumulates in the bloodstream over years, football's ethical compromises had reached a concentration that threatened the health of the entire system. But the real reckoning was still to come. The shadows were growing deeper, and in their darkness, new forms of corruption were evolving that would make the schemes of earlier eras seem like innocent childhood games. Chicago, in the 1920s, was a city that understood the poetry of corruption, where legitimate business and criminal enterprise danced together in speakeasies thick with cigarette smoke and whispered deals. It was here, in this landscape of beautiful lawlessness, that professional football found its footing and discovered that the line between sport and spectacle could be crossed without anyone particularly caring, as long as the entertainment value remained high and the money continued to flow. The Chicago Bears, under the guidance of George Halas, were transforming from a ragtag collection of former college players into something approaching a professional organization. But professionalism in this context meant more than simply paying players for their services. It meant understanding that football, like any other form of entertainment in Prohibition-era Chicago, existed in a moral gray area where success was measured not by adherence to abstract principles, but by the ability to deliver what audiences craved. Halas himself was a fascinating figure, a man who embodied the contradictions that would define professional football for generations. He spoke eloquently about the character-building virtues of competitive sport, while simultaneously pioneering business practices that reduced players to interchangeable commodities. He promoted football as wholesome family entertainment, while tolerating behavior on and off the field that would have scandalized the amateur ideal he claimed to honor. The relationship between professional football and organized crime during this period was never officially acknowledged, but it permeated the sports culture in ways both obvious and subtle. Gambling on games was ubiquitous, not just among fans but among players, coaches, and team officials. Bookmakers operated openly in and around stadiums, and their odds were discussed as casually as weather forecasts in the sports pages of Chicago newspapers. This normalization of gambling created an environment where more serious forms of corruption could flourish without drawing particular attention. If everyone accepted that games would be bet upon, it became easier to ignore questions about whether those bets might occasionally influence the outcomes being wagered upon. The infrastructure for corruption was being built not through criminal conspiracy, but through cultural acceptance of moral flexibility. Consider the career of Red Grange, the galloping ghost, who became professional football's first genuine superstar when he joined the Bears in 1925. Grange's signing was celebrated as a watershed moment that would legitimize the professional game and attract the kind of mainstream attention that college football had long enjoyed. But the circumstances surrounding Grange's recruitment and the terms of his contract revealed the extent to which professional football operated according to principles that had little to do with sporting competition. Grange's agent, C.C. Pyle, negotiated a deal that gave the young star not just a salary, but a percentage of gate receipts and merchandising revenue, arrangements that effectively made him a business partner rather than an employee. More troubling were the rumors, never officially confirmed but widely whispered, that Grange's performance in crucial games might vary depending on factors that had nothing to do with his health or preparation. The Grange signing also revealed the extent to which college and professional football were engaged in what amounted to a protection racket. College officials publicly condemned the professional game as a corrupting influence that threatened to destroy amateur sport, while privately negotiating agreements that allowed their former players to turn professional without jeopardizing the eligibility of current team members. These arrangements created a system where corruption was simultaneously condemned and accommodated, where moral boundaries were clearly articulated and systematically violated. The 1925 championship controversy between the Chicago Cardinals and the Pottsville Maroons provided a window into the kind of bureaucratic manipulation that would become characteristic of professional football's approach to ethical challenges. The Cardinals claimed the title based on a late-season game against a hastily assembled team of college all-stars that had been recruited specifically to provide Chicago with an easy victory. When the Maroons protested that this arrangement violated league rules, they were expelled from the NFL for scheduling their own game against a college team. The absurdity of this situation, punishing one team for the same behavior that was being rewarded in another, revealed that the NFL's commitment to competitive integrity was subordinate to other considerations. The Cardinals were based in Chicago, the league's most important market. The Maroons represented a small Pennsylvania city with limited commercial potential. The decision to award the championship to Chicago had less to do with what happened on the field than with what would be best for the league's long-term business interests. This incident established a precedent that would govern professional football's approach to controversy for decades to come. Rules would be enforced selectively, based not on objective standards of fairness, but on calculations about what would most benefit the league's public image and financial position. Justice would be secondary to utility, and competitive integrity would be sacrificed whenever it conflicted with commercial imperatives. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent economic depression created new pressures and new opportunities for corruption in professional football. Teams that had operated on thin profit margins during the prosperous 1920s now faced existential threats to their survival. Players who had commanded decent salaries found themselves competing for positions that paid barely enough to cover basic living expenses. The economic desperation created conditions where ethical corners could be cut without seeming particularly scandalous. Everyone was struggling, and everyone was making compromises. But the Depression also created new audiences for professional football, as Americans sought inexpensive entertainment that could provide temporary escape from economic hardship. Radio broadcasts of games became more popular than ever, creating new revenue streams for teams and new opportunities for those who understood how to monetize public attention. The desperation of the times made audiences more willing to overlook questions about the integrity of what they were watching, as long as it provided the emotional satisfaction they craved. The emergence of the college draft in 1936 was presented as a reform designed to promote competitive balance by preventing wealthy teams from monopolizing the best talent. But the draft also institutionalized a form of labor exploitation that would have been illegal in any other industry. Young men who had generated millions in revenue for their college programs were assigned to professional teams without any input into the decision, and their bargaining power was deliberately minimized through agreements between teams not to compete for their services. The draft created new forms of corruption as teams sought to gain advantages within the supposedly objective system of talent allocation. College coaches could be influenced to recommend players to specific teams. Medical information could be selectively shared or withheld to affect draft position. The scouting process, which was supposed to be based on objective evaluation of athletic ability, became another arena where personal relationships, financial considerations could influence outcomes. By the end of the 1930s, professional football had established itself as a permanent fixture in American sports culture. But its legitimacy rested on increasingly unstable foundations. The sport generated significant revenue and provided genuine entertainment value, but its operations depended on a complex web of agreements and accommodations that often contradicted its public image. Players were presented as athletic heroes while being treated as disposable employees. Games were promoted as pure competition while being shaped by considerations that had nothing to do with sport. The corruption that characterized this era was not typically the crude bribery and game fixing that would dominate later scandals. Instead, it was a more sophisticated form of institutional dishonesty, where organizations systematically operated according to principles they publicly disavowed. The lies were not told to hide specific crimes, but to maintain general fictions about the nature and purposes of professional sport. World War II would provide another interruption to these developing patterns, as the sport's personnel and attention turned to more pressing concerns. But when professional football resumed after the war, it would inherit all the structural problems and ethical compromises of the pre-war era, along with new opportunities for corruption created by the dramatic social and economic changes the war had produced. The shadows were growing longer, and in their darkness, new forms of deception were taking shape that would make the moral flexibility of the 1920s and the 1930s seem like innocent preparation for the more sophisticated corruptions that lay ahead. The 1950s arrived with the promise of prosperity and the gleaming veneer of American optimism, but beneath the surface of suburbia and television dinners, professional football was constructing an edifice of systematic deception that would define the sport for generations. This was the era when football learned to package corruption as tradition, when institutional lying became so sophisticated that it fooled even those who participated in its construction. Television changed everything, though not in the ways that anyone expected. The medium promised to democratize access to the sport, bringing games into living rooms across the nation and creating a truly national audience for what had been primarily regional entertainment. But television also created new pressures for controllable outcomes, for games that would provide satisfying narratives and dramatic climaxes regardless of what actually happened between the lines. The National Football League, under the leadership of Commissioner Bert Bell, began developing what we might call the integrity management system, a complex apparatus designed not to prevent corruption, but to control its visibility and manage its consequences. Bell understood that the sport's commercial success depended on maintaining public confidence in competitive fairness, but he also recognized that the financial pressures and human weaknesses inherent in professional athletics made some forms of corruption inevitable. The solution was not elimination, but compartmentalization. Certain types of rule-breaking would be tolerated as long as they remained invisible to the public, and did not threaten the fundamental narrative of honest competition. Other violations would be punished with theatrical severity, serving as proof of the league's commitment to integrity, while actually functioning as misdirection from more systematic problems. This approach reached its most sophisticated expression in the league's handling of gambling, which by the 1950s had become the sport's most persistent and troubling source of corruption. Rather than attempting to eliminate gambling entirely, a task that Bell recognized as impossible, the NFL developed elaborate protocols for monitoring and controlling its impact on game outcomes. Players were regularly lectured about the dangers of associating with gamblers, while team officials maintained relationships with bookmakers that allowed them to track betting patterns and identify potential threats to competitive integrity. The 1946 championship game between the Chicago Bears and New York Giants provided an early test of this system. Rumors circulated before the game that several Giants players had been approached by gamblers offering substantial payments to ensure that New York would not cover the point spread. The NFL's investigation, conducted with great fanfare, concluded that no rules had been violated, but the betting line on the game shifted dramatically in the days before kickoff, suggesting that someone with inside information was placing substantial wagers. What made this incident significant was not the suspected corruption itself, but the league's response to it. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about the relationship between professional football and organized gambling, the NFL focused on managing public perception. Press releases emphasized the league's vigilance in protecting competitive integrity, while privately, team officials worked to ensure that similar situations would be handled more discreetly in the future. The introduction of the Pro Bowl in 1951 created new opportunities for what we might call performance management. All-Star games had always been exhibitions where the quality of play was secondary to entertainment value, but the Pro Bowl became something more sophisticated, a laboratory for testing the boundaries between authentic competition and manufactured spectacle. Players selected for the Pro Bowl understood that their performance would be evaluated not just on athletic ability, but on their contribution to the overall entertainment package. Defensive players were encouraged to make spectacular but ultimately ineffective plays that would look impressive on television. Offensive players were coached to attempt dramatic but low-percentage passes that would provide exciting moments regardless of whether they were completed. This approach to managing competition extended beyond all-star games into regular season play. Coaches began developing strategies designed not just to win games, but to win them in ways that would satisfy television audiences and maintain betting interest. The emphasis shifted from efficiency to spectacle, from pragmatic tactics to dramatic narratives. The college draft during this period became an exercise in elaborate theater, where teams invested enormous resources in scouting and evaluation, while simultaneously engaging in systematic deception about their true intentions. The public draft process, introduced in 1958, was presented as a transparent demonstration of how teams made personnel decisions. But it actually concealed a complex network of pre-draft agreements and side deals that had already determined most selections. Teams would conduct elaborate smokescreen campaigns designed to mislead their competitors about which players they intended to select. False rumors would be circulated about medical problems or character issues that didn't exist. Coaches would publicly praise players they had no intention of drafting while privately negotiating for the services of others. The draft became a competition not just for talent, but for information, where success depended as much on deception as on evaluation. The emergence of player agents during the late 1950s added another layer of complexity to this system. Agents were presented as advocates for player interests, but many operated according to principles that had little to do with their clients' welfare. The most successful agents were those who understood that their real job was not representing players, but managing the flow of information between players, teams, and the media. These agents became middlemen in corruption, facilitating arrangements that benefited all parties while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. A player might receive compensation that technically violated league rules, but the payment would be structured in ways that made prosecution difficult and discovery unlikely. Teams could gain competitive advantages through questionable means while maintaining their public image as ethical organizations. The 1958 championship game between the Baltimore Colts and New York Giants is often cited as the moment when professional football achieved true national prominence. But it also marked a turning point in the sport's relationship with authenticity. The game's dramatic overtime finish was celebrated as proof of football's capacity to provide genuine excitement. But subsequent investigations revealed that several key plays had been influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with winning or losing. The Colts' decision to attempt a field goal late in regulation, which would have ended the game without the dramatic overtime period that captivated television audiences, was reportedly influenced by conversations between team officials and league executives about the entertainment value of different possible outcomes. The Giants' defensive strategy in overtime was similarly shaped by an understanding that certain types of plays would be more satisfying for viewers than others. This was not game fixing in the traditional sense. Both teams were genuinely trying to win, and the outcome was determined by authentic athletic competition. But it was something more subtle, and perhaps more troubling: the systematic subordination of competitive integrity to entertainment value, where strategic decisions were influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with sport. The decade ended with professional football established as a major force in American entertainment, but its success rested on foundations that were increasingly divorced from the sporting principles it claimed to embody. The sport had learned to generate enormous profits while maintaining the fiction of pure competition, to accommodate systematic rule-breaking while projecting an image of ethical leadership. The corruption that characterized this era was not typically the crude bribery and game-fixing that would dominate later scandals. Instead, it was a more sophisticated form of institutional deception, where the entire structure of professional football was designed to obscure rather than illuminate the true nature of what was being presented to the public. As the 1960s began, these patterns were becoming so deeply embedded in the sports culture that they seemed natural and inevitable rather than chosen and maintained. The shadows had grown so pervasive that they no longer seemed like shadows at all. They had become the landscape itself, and few people could remember what it had looked like when the light was clearer. The 1960s descended upon American football like a spotlight suddenly illuminating a stage that had grown comfortable in shadow. Television, which had begun as a passive observer of the sport, evolved into something far more powerful and complex. A medium that didn't just broadcast games, but fundamentally altered their nature, creating new pressures for spectacle and new opportunities for those who understood that controlling the narrative was often more valuable than controlling the game itself. The decade began with a scandal that should have served as a warning about the dangers of treating sport as pure entertainment, but instead became a template for how future corruptions would be managed and contained. Paul Hornung and Alex Karras, two of the NFL's brightest stars, were suspended for the entire 1963 season for gambling on games. Not games they played in, but games involving other teams. The punishment was severe enough to demonstrate the league's seriousness about maintaining competitive integrity. But the investigation was limited enough to avoid uncomfortable questions about how widespread such activities might be. Commissioner Pete Rozell's handling of the Hornung-Karras situation revealed a sophisticated understanding of corruption management that would define the NFL's approach for decades to come. The suspensions were announced with great fanfare, accompanied by stern lectures about the importance of maintaining public trust in the sport's integrity. But the investigation itself was conducted with surgical precision, focusing only on activities that could be proven beyond doubt, while carefully avoiding broader inquiries that might have revealed more systematic problems. Hornung, the golden boy from Green Bay, was portrayed as a fundamentally good man who had made serious errors in judgment. His gambling was presented as an isolated lapse rather than part of a broader pattern of behavior that might have included other forms of corruption. The narrative constructed around his case emphasized redemption and second chances rather than institutional accountability or systemic reform. The timing of the suspensions was also significant. They were announced during the off-season, allowing the immediate shock to dissipate before the start of the following season. By the time Hornung and Karras returned to active play, the scandal had been transformed from a crisis into a success story about the league's commitment to ethical leadership and its capacity for forgiveness. But while the NFL was publicly congratulating itself for handling the gambling scandal with appropriate seriousness, other forms of corruption were evolving in response to the new pressures created by television. The medium's appetite for compelling narratives created incentives for manufacturing drama where none naturally existed, for ensuring that games would provide satisfying entertainment regardless of what actually happened on the field. This pressure was most evident in the increasing sophistication of what we might call outcome management, the subtle manipulation of game conditions to influence results without directly determining them. Referees began receiving more detailed instructions about how to call certain types of penalties, with particular emphasis on infractions that could swing momentum at crucial moments. The enforcement of rules became less about maintaining fairness and more about ensuring that games remained competitive and entertaining. The merger negotiations between the NFL and the upstart American Football League provided another window into the sport's evolving relationship with authenticity. The two leagues had been engaged in what was publicly described as intense competition for talent and market share. But privately, officials from both organizations were coordinating their activities to ensure that their war would generate maximum publicity while minimizing actual financial damage to either side. The secret meetings between NFL and AFL representatives, which began as early as 1964, revealed that the competition between the leagues was as much performance as genuine rivalry. Bidding wars for college talent were carefully managed to create the impression of intense competition while ensuring that neither league would be bankrupted by escalating player salaries. The scheduling of games was coordinated to avoid direct competition in television markets, where such conflict might damage both organizations. When the merger was finally announced in 1966, it was presented as a marriage of equals that would benefit players, fans, and the sport itself. But the terms of the agreement revealed that the AFL had been the junior partner throughout the negotiations, accepting conditions that essentially amounted to absorption by the more established league. The Super Bowl, which was supposed to be a championship game between the winners of two separate leagues, was actually the conclusion of an elaborate performance designed to generate publicity for what had already been decided in corporate boardrooms. The first Super Bowl, played in January 1967 between the Green Bay Packers and Kansas City Chiefs, was a commercial disappointment that failed to sell out despite extensive promotional efforts. The game itself was competitive enough to maintain interest, but the halftime show and other entertainment elements revealed the extent to which the NFL was willing to subordinate sporting authenticity to commercial considerations. The halftime performance featured college marching bands rather than professional entertainers. But even this supposedly amateur presentation was carefully choreographed to create specific emotional responses in television audiences. The bands were instructed to play particular songs at particular volumes, to march in formations that would photograph well from aerial cameras, to coordinate their movements with commercial breaks and network programming requirements. This subordination of sporting elements to entertainment considerations became even more pronounced in subsequent Super Bowls. By the early 1970s, the game had evolved into something closer to a variety show that happened to include a football game, where the athletic competition was just one element in a broader multimedia experience designed to maximize advertising revenue and cultural impact. The introduction of Monday Night Football in 1970 marked another watershed moment in the sport's evolution away from pure competition toward managed spectacle. The show's format, developed by ABC executive Roone Arledge, was designed around the principle that sports broadcasting should be entertaining first and informative second. Games were selected not necessarily because they featured the best teams or most meaningful matchups, but because they promised to provide compelling television regardless of the actual quality of play. Howard Cosell, the show's most controversial and influential commentator, understood that his role was not simply to describe what was happening on the field, but to create narratives that would sustain viewer interest even during periods when the game itself was boring. Cosell's approach to sports commentary was fundamentally theatrical, turning players into characters and games into dramatic performances with predetermined story arcs and emotional climaxes. This approach to sports presentation had profound implications for the sport itself. Players and coaches began adjusting their behavior to accommodate the demands of television production. Controversial personalities were cultivated because they generated higher ratings than competent but uninteresting alternatives. Coaching strategies were influenced by an understanding that certain types of plays would be more visually exciting than others, regardless of their effectiveness. The decade also saw the emergence of more sophisticated forms of performance-enhancing drug use, though these activities were rarely acknowledged publicly and almost never investigated seriously. The pressure to produce ever more spectacular athletic performances for television audiences created incentives for players to experiment with substances and techniques that pushed the boundaries of human capability, while keeping those enhancements invisible to casual observers. Unlike the crude drug use that would characterize later eras, the performance enhancement of the 1960s and early 1970s was typically more subtle and more thoroughly integrated into training regimens and medical care. Players were provided with substances that were technically legal but ethically questionable. Treatments that enhanced performance while maintaining plausible deniability about their true nature and purpose. Team physicians became complicit in these arrangements, prescribing medications and treatments that had little to do with healing injuries and everything to do with maximizing athletic performance. The medical staffs of professional football teams evolved into something resembling pharmaceutical research divisions, experimenting with combinations of drugs and therapies that pushed players beyond their natural limitations while maintaining the fiction of legitimate medical care. The Vietnam War created additional moral complications for the sport, as professional football struggled to maintain its image as a patriotic institution, while many of its stars received deferments that allowed them to continue playing rather than serving in the military. The draft system that governed both military service and professional sports created opportunities for influence peddling and corruption that were never fully investigated or acknowledged. Some players received educational deferments based on academic progress that existed only on paper. Others were classified as essential personnel by teams that had developed relationships with local draft boards. The most troubling cases involved players who were declared medically unfit for military service due to conditions that had no apparent impact on their ability to play professional football at the highest level. These arrangements were rarely discussed publicly, but they created an atmosphere of cynicism that permeated the sports culture. Players understood that the institutions governing their lives operated according to principles of convenience rather than consistency, that rules existed to be manipulated by those with sufficient resources and connections. This understanding influenced their approach to other aspects of their professional lives, creating attitudes toward rule-breaking that would have consequences far beyond the immediate context of military service. The decade ended with professional football established as one of America's most popular and profitable forms of entertainment. But its success had come at the cost of systematic compromise with the sporting principles it claimed to represent. The sport had learned to generate enormous revenues while maintaining elaborate fictions about its true nature and purposes, to accommodate widespread rule-breaking while projecting an image of ethical leadership and competitive integrity. As the 1970s began, these patterns of institutional deception had become so deeply embedded in the sports culture that they seemed natural and inevitable rather than chosen and maintained. The corruption was no longer an aberration to be corrected, but a fundamental feature of how professional football operated, so thoroughly normalized that most participants had forgotten what the alternatives might look like. The 1970s brought with them a different kind of darkness, one that smelled of leather and artificial turf, of locker room liniment mixed with something sharper, more dangerous. This was the decade when professional football discovered that the line between performance enhancement and self-destruction could be crossed without anyone noticing until it was far too late, when the sports culture of controlled violence found new expressions in substances that promised transcendence, but delivered only deeper forms of bondage. Cocaine arrived in NFL locker rooms like a perfectly engineered solution to problems that players had never realized they were allowed to solve. The drug promised energy without fatigue, confidence without doubt, pain relief without the grogginess of traditional painkillers. It seemed tailor-made for a sport that demanded superhuman performance while maintaining the fiction that its participants were merely talented human beings doing what came naturally. The drug's appeal was not just physiological, but cultural. Cocaine was expensive, glamorous, associated with successful people in entertainment and business who understood that certain rules were meant for others. For professional football players, many of whom had grown up in poverty and found themselves suddenly wealthy but still uncertain about their place in American society, cocaine represented membership in an exclusive club of people who could afford to live according to different standards. But cocaine also provided something more specific to the culture of professional football, a way to manage the psychological contradictions inherent in a sport that demanded both aggression and control, violence and precision, individual excellence and team subordination. The drug allowed players to exist simultaneously in states of hyper-awareness and emotional numbness, to perform with mechanical efficiency while feeling invulnerable to consequences. The Pittsburgh Steelers of this era provide perhaps the most complex example of how cocaine culture intersected with football success. The team won 4 Super Bowls during the 1970s, establishing itself as one of the greatest dynasties in sports history. but their dominance coincided with what would later be revealed as systematic drug use that extended throughout the organization. The Steelers' success was built on a defense that played with an intensity and ferocity that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Players like Jack Lambert and Jack Ham appeared capable of maintaining peak performance levels throughout entire games, showing no signs of the fatigue or decreased reaction time that typically characterized late-game play. Their ability to sustain maximum effort while making split-second decisions under extreme physical stress became legendary, but it was also, as would later become clear, chemically enhanced. Chuck Noll, the team's coach, cultivated an image as a disciplinarian who demanded the highest standards of professional conduct from his players. But Noll's definition of professionalism was narrowly focused on performance and results rather than the methods used to achieve them. As long as players showed up prepared to play and executed their assignments effectively, questions about how they maintained their readiness were considered private matters beyond the scope of coaching responsibility. This approach created an environment where drug use could flourish without acknowledgement or oversight. Players understood that their pharmaceutical choices would not be scrutinized as long as those choices did not interfere with their athletic performance. The irony, of course, was that cocaine initially enhanced rather than hindered performance, making its use seem not just acceptable, but almost mandatory for players who wanted to maintain their competitive edge. The Dallas Cowboys, America's self-proclaimed team, developed an even more sophisticated approach to managing the relationship between drug use and public image. Under the leadership of coach Tom Landry, the Cowboys cultivated a reputation for clean living and Christian values that provided perfect cover for activities that directly contradicted their public persona. The Cowboys' system was built around compartmentalization and plausible deniability. Team officials maintained strict policies against drug use, while simultaneously creating conditions where such use was practically inevitable. Players were subjected to enormous pressure to perform at superhuman levels, while being provided with minimal support for managing the physical and psychological stress of their profession. The result was a culture where drug use became a form of self-medication that players pursued independently, while maintaining the fiction that they were simply exceptionally dedicated athletes. The Cowboys' success during this period, they appeared in 5 Super Bowls during the 1970s, provided evidence that their approach was effective, at least in terms of winning games and generating revenue. But the true extent of cocaine's penetration into professional football culture became clear only gradually, as individual cases of addiction and legal trouble began to accumulate throughout the decade. Players who had been celebrated as exemplars of athletic achievement were revealed to be struggling with dependencies that had developed under the noses of coaches and team officials, who claimed to be shocked by these discoveries. The case of Hollywood Henderson, the Cowboys linebacker who became one of the most visible symbols of football's cocaine problem, illustrated how thoroughly the drug had become integrated into the sports culture. Henderson's use began as a performance enhancement tool, but evolved into a full-blown addiction that eventually destroyed his career and nearly killed him. What made his case particularly significant was not the fact of his addiction, but the way it had been enabled and concealed by the institutional structures of professional football. Henderson received cocaine from teammates, coaches, and team officials who understood his dependency but chose to manage rather than address it. As long as his performance remained at an acceptable level, his drug use was treated as a personal choice rather than a team problem. Only when his addiction began to interfere with his ability to play effectively did the Cowboys organization acknowledge that a problem existed. The league's response to growing evidence of widespread drug use followed the same pattern of selective enforcement and damage control that had characterized its approach to other forms of corruption. Individual cases were handled with great publicity and apparent seriousness, while the systemic issues that had created conditions for widespread drug use were largely ignored. Commissioner Pete Rozelle announced tough new policies regarding drug use, while simultaneously avoiding investigations that might have revealed how thoroughly substances like cocaine had penetrated the sports culture. The focus was on punishment rather than prevention, on managing public perception rather than addressing underlying causes. The drug testing programs implemented during this period were designed more for public relations purposes than for actual detection of substance use. Testing was infrequent, predictable, and focused on substances that were easy to detect rather than those that were most commonly used. Players quickly learned how to time their drug use to avoid detection while maintaining their enhanced performance capabilities. More troubling was the discovery that some team medical staffs were actively facilitating drug use through prescription practices that pushed the boundaries of legitimate medical care. Players were provided with amphetamines, painkillers, and other substances that were technically legal but functionally equivalent to street drugs in their effects and addictive potential. The line between medical treatment and performance enhancement became increasingly blurred as team physicians developed sophisticated understanding of how various substances could be used to optimize athletic performance while maintaining plausible medical justification for their prescription. Players became willing participants in what amounted to pharmaceutical experimentation, accepting unknown risks in exchange for competitive advantages. The gambling scandals that emerged during the late 1970s revealed another dimension of how drug use had complicated the sport's relationship with corruption. Players whose drug habits required significant financial resources became vulnerable to influence from gamblers and other criminal elements who understood that addiction created leverage that could be exploited for various purposes. The point-shaving schemes that were discovered during this period were typically more sophisticated than simple game fixing. Instead of attempting to determine game outcomes, corrupt influences focused on affecting margins of victory in ways that would influence betting results while maintaining the appearance of competitive integrity. A player under financial pressure due to drug expenses might be convinced to commit penalties at crucial moments, or to miss tackles that would allow opponents to score additional points. These arrangements were almost impossible to detect through conventional oversight methods because they required only subtle changes in performance, rather than obvious alterations in game outcomes. A defensive back might arrive at the point of interception a split second later than optimal, allowing a completion that should have been prevented. A running back might choose a slightly less effective path through defensive formations, reducing his yardage gains without making his diminished performance obvious to casual observers. The decade ended with professional football more popular and profitable than ever, but also more thoroughly compromised by forms of corruption that had become integral to its operation. The sport had learned to accommodate systematic drug use while maintaining its image as a symbol of American virtue and competitive excellence. The shadows had grown so pervasive that they no longer seemed like shadows at all. They had become the natural environment in which the sport operated. As the 1980s began, these patterns of institutional compromise and moral flexibility had become so deeply embedded in football culture that they seemed inevitable rather than chosen. The corruption was no longer an external threat to be resisted, but an internal reality to be managed. And the sport's leadership had developed sophisticated mechanisms for controlling its visibility, while allowing its essential functions to continue undisturbed. The 1980s arrived with the chrome bright gleam of excess, a decade that would transform professional football from a popular sport into a cultural colossus, while simultaneously perfecting the art of institutional amnesia, the systematic forgetting of inconvenient truths in service of more convenient mythologies. This was the era when the National Football League learned to operate as both a sporting organization and a propaganda machine, generating profits that defied rational explanation while maintaining narratives that defied logical scrutiny. The decade began with a player strike that revealed fault lines in the sport's carefully constructed public image. The 1982 work stoppage, which reduced the season to 9 games, was officially about money and working conditions. But it also exposed the extent to which players had become commodities in an entertainment industry that generated enormous wealth while treating its primary performers as interchangeable parts in a vast commercial machine. The strike's aftermath saw the emergence of what we might call managed reconciliation, a sophisticated process of healing that focused on restoring public confidence while avoiding uncomfortable questions about the underlying issues that had caused the conflict. Players were encouraged to express gratitude for their privileged positions, while team owners promoted narratives about shared sacrifice and mutual dedication to the sport's higher purposes. But the real story of the strike was not the temporary disruption it caused, but the permanent changes it revealed in how professional football operated. The replacement games, played with amateur and semi-professional players, demonstrated that the sport's entertainment value was not entirely dependent on elite athletic performance. Audiences would watch inferior football as long as it was packaged and presented with sufficient promotional sophistication. This discovery had profound implications for the sport's relationship with authenticity. If fans would accept replacement players performing at dramatically reduced levels of competency, what other compromises might they be willing to tolerate as long as the overall entertainment experience remained satisfying? The strike inadvertently became a test of how much corruption the sport could accommodate without losing its audience, and the results suggested that the tolerance level was remarkably high. The emergence of ESPN during this period created new pressures and new opportunities for managing public perception of the sport. The 24-hour sports news cycle meant that every aspect of professional football would be subjected to constant scrutiny. But it also meant that individual stories could be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information being produced. Scandals that might have dominated headlines for weeks during earlier eras could be displaced within days by newer controversies or more compelling narratives. ESPN's approach to sports journalism was fundamentally different from traditional newspaper coverage. The network's business model depended on maintaining positive relationships with the leagues and teams that provided content for its programming, creating incentives for coverage that emphasized entertainment value over investigative depth. Serious examinations of corruption or institutional failure were balanced by features that celebrated the sport's positive aspects, ensuring that critical coverage would not threaten the cooperative relationships on which the network's success depended. This approach to sports media coverage created what we might call managed transparency, a system where information about corruption and rule-breaking was regularly reported, but presented in ways that minimized its significance and normalized its existence. Audiences were informed about various scandals and controversies, but the coverage focused on individual cases rather than systemic problems, on personal failures rather than institutional shortcomings. The cocaine epidemic that had begun during the 1970s reached its full flowering during the mid-1980s, but the league's response revealed how thoroughly it had mastered the art of crisis management. Rather than acknowledging the systematic nature of drug use throughout professional football, the NFL focused on a series of high-profile individual cases that could be used to demonstrate both the seriousness of the problem and the effectiveness of the league's response. The suspension of several prominent players for drug violations was accompanied by the introduction of comprehensive testing programs and treatment initiatives that were presented as evidence of the league's commitment to addressing substance abuse issues. But these programs were designed as much for public relations purposes as for actual drug prevention, focusing on detection and punishment rather than the underlying conditions that had made drug use so attractive to players. The testing protocols implemented during this period were sophisticated enough to catch players who were careless about their drug use, while remaining ineffective against those who had access to better information and resources. The result was a system that primarily caught and punished players from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, while allowing more affluent and better connected individuals to continue using substances with minimal risk of detection. More troubling was the discovery that some of the league's drug treatment programs were being used as intelligence-gathering operations designed to identify players who might be vulnerable to various forms of influence or coercion. Information obtained through supposedly confidential counseling sessions was shared with team officials and league executives, who used it for purposes that had nothing to do with player welfare or public health. The Super Bowl during this decade evolved into something that transcended sport entirely, becoming a cultural event that functioned as both entertainment spectacular and economic engine. The halftime shows, in particular, revealed the extent to which the NFL was willing to subordinate sporting considerations to commercial imperatives. The 1987 Super Bowl halftime show, featuring a tribute to Hollywood's centennial celebration, included elaborate musical and dance performances that had been choreographed not around the game itself, but around commercial breaks and advertising requirements. The entertainment was designed to create specific emotional responses in television audiences at precisely timed intervals, ensuring that viewers would remain engaged throughout the advertising segments that generated the majority of the event's revenue. But the Super Bowl also became a laboratory for testing more subtle forms of outcome management. The games during this period were notable for their tendency to remain competitive until the final moments, regardless of the apparent talent differential between the participating teams. This pattern was achieved not through crude game fixing, but through sophisticated adjustments in officiating, game management, and strategic decision-making that ensured dramatic conclusions without obviously predetermined outcomes. Referees received detailed instructions about how to manage game flow to maintain television audience interest. Penalties would be called or ignored based on considerations that included current score differential, time remaining, and television ratings data. The enforcement of rules became subordinate to the production of entertaining spectacle, with competitive integrity sacrificed whenever it conflicted with commercial imperatives. The college recruiting scandals that emerged during the late 1980s provided another window into the sport's evolving relationship with corruption. The Southern Methodist University football program received the death penalty, complete suspension of its football program, for systematic rule violations that included cash payments to players and elaborate schemes to circumvent NCAA regulations. But the SMU case was significant, not because it represented unusual behavior, but because it represented normal behavior that had been discovered and punished. The violations documented at Southern Methodist were occurring throughout college football, but most programs had developed more sophisticated methods of concealment that made detection and prosecution unlikely. The death penalty imposed on SMU was intended to serve as a deterrent to other programs, but it actually functioned as a tutorial in corruption management. Other schools studied the SMU case not to learn how to avoid rule violations, but to learn how to commit them more effectively. The punishment demonstrated that the NCAA was capable of severe enforcement actions, but it also revealed the specific types of evidence and procedural mistakes that could trigger such responses. The decade also saw the emergence of more sophisticated forms of academic fraud designed to maintain player eligibility while providing minimal actual education. The paper classes and no-show courses that became common during this period were not crude attempts to circumvent academic requirements, but carefully designed systems that provided official transcripts documenting educational achievement that existed primarily on paper. These arrangements were typically developed in cooperation with academic administrators who understood that their institution's financial success depended on maintaining successful football programs. Professors were encouraged to develop courses that would accommodate the scheduling and academic limitations of student athletes, while academic advisors worked to ensure that players would remain eligible regardless of their actual educational progress. The decade ended with professional football more popular and profitable than ever, but also more thoroughly divorced from the sporting principles it claimed to represent. The sport had perfected the art of generating enormous revenues while maintaining elaborate fictions about competitive integrity and educational mission. The corruption had become so systematic and so thoroughly normalized that it was no longer recognized as corruption at all. It had become simply the way business was conducted. As the 1990s began, these patterns of institutional deception and moral compromise had achieved a kind of equilibrium where they could operate indefinitely without threatening the sport's commercial success or cultural influence. The shadows had not merely grown longer, they had become the primary source of illumination, and few people could remember what the landscape had looked like before they had learned to see by this strange, distorted light. The 1990s descended upon professional football like a digital dawn, promising transparency and accountability through technological advancement, but instead delivering new forms of opacity and more sophisticated methods of deception. This was the decade when the sport learned to weaponize information itself, transforming data from a tool of illumination into an instrument of obfuscation, where statistics could be manipulated to support any narrative and where the proliferation of coverage created more opportunities for misdirection rather than clarity. The decade began with a different kind of scandal, one that revealed how thoroughly money had corrupted not just individual behavior, but institutional thinking. The savings and loan crisis of the early 1990s exposed the extent to which professional football teams had become vehicles for financial manipulation that had little to do with athletic competition. Team ownership had evolved into a form of sophisticated money laundering, where legitimate business revenues could be mixed with funds from questionable sources while maintaining the respectability that came with association with America's most popular sport. Several team owners were revealed to have connections to financial institutions that had engaged in fraudulent lending practices, using their football franchises as collateral for loans that were never intended to be repaid. The teams themselves became instruments in complex schemes designed to move money through multiple jurisdictions, while avoiding regulatory oversight that might have revealed the true nature of these transactions. But the most troubling aspect of these revelations was not the individual cases of financial fraud, but the discovery that the NFL's ownership approval process had been designed to facilitate rather than prevent such arrangements. The league's due diligence procedures were elaborate enough to provide the appearance of careful vetting, while remaining superficial enough to avoid discovering information that might complicate profitable relationships. The introduction of salary caps during this period was presented as a reform designed to promote competitive balance and fiscal responsibility. But it actually created new opportunities for creative accounting and systematic rule evasion. Teams quickly developed sophisticated methods for circumventing spending limits through deferred compensation, creative contract structuring, and off-the-books payments that technically violated league rules while remaining virtually impossible to detect or prosecute. The salary cap also institutionalized a form of collusion between team owners who agreed to suppress player wages while maintaining the fiction of competitive bidding for talent. The system created artificial scarcity that reduced labor costs while generating public relations benefits from the appearance of fiscal discipline and competitive fairness. Free agency, which was supposed to give players more control over their careers and compensation, instead became another mechanism for sophisticated exploitation. The system was designed to appear player-friendly, while actually creating conditions where teams could manipulate player movement and salary levels through coordinated strategies that technically complied with league rules while violating their spirit. The emergence of the Internet during the mid-1990s should have created new opportunities for independent investigation and reporting of corruption in professional football. But instead, it became another tool for managing public perception and controlling narratives. The proliferation of information sources made it easier to overwhelm audiences with data while making it more difficult to distinguish between reliable reporting and sophisticated propaganda. Team-controlled websites and official league platforms began producing enormous volumes of content that appeared to provide comprehensive coverage of football-related issues, while actually functioning as elaborate public relations operations. Stories about corruption and rule-breaking were balanced by features celebrating the sport's positive aspects, ensuring that critical information would be diluted within a larger stream of promotional material. The fantasy football phenomenon that exploded during this decade created new forms of audience engagement that were simultaneously genuine and manufactured. Players became commodities to be traded and evaluated based on statistical performance, creating new incentives for outcome management that had nothing to do with team success or competitive integrity. Fantasy football also generated new revenue streams that were based on maintaining public confidence in the statistical accuracy of game results, creating pressure for more sophisticated forms of performance manipulation. Games needed to produce statistics that would satisfy fantasy participants while maintaining the appearance of authentic competition, requiring forms of outcome management that were more subtle than simple game fixing, but more systematic than random variation. The rise of sports talk radio during this period created another mechanism for managing public discourse about corruption in professional football. The format appeared to provide open forums for discussion and debate, but the shows were actually carefully controlled environments where controversial topics could be addressed in ways that minimized their significance while creating the impression of thorough examination. Talk radio hosts developed sophisticated techniques for discussing corruption scandals in ways that satisfied audience curiosity, while avoiding conclusions that might threaten their relationships with teams and leagues. Serious allegations would be mentioned but quickly dismissed or redirected toward less threatening topics. Critical information would be presented but surrounded by speculation and entertainment content that reduced its impact. The steroid era that began during the late 1990s represented a new form of performance enhancement that was both more systematic and more invisible than previous drug use. Unlike cocaine, which had obvious behavioral effects that could be detected by casual observation, steroids provided performance benefits that could be attributed to improved training methods or natural athletic development. The sophistication of steroid use during this period was remarkable. Players worked with chemists and medical professionals to develop customized enhancement protocols that were designed around specific athletic requirements and testing schedules. The substances used were often technically legal or so new that they had not yet been banned by league policies. Team medical staffs became complicit in these arrangements, providing oversight and support for enhancement programs while maintaining plausible deniability about their true nature. Players were monitored for adverse health effects and provided with additional substances to counteract the negative consequences of steroid use, creating comprehensive pharmaceutical programs that bore little resemblance to legitimate medical care. The league's response to growing evidence of systematic steroid use followed familiar patterns of selective enforcement and damage control. Testing programs were implemented with great fanfare while being designed to catch only the most careless users. The focus remained on individual cases rather than systemic problems, on punishment rather than prevention. But the steroid era also revealed new forms of corruption in the relationships between professional football and the pharmaceutical industry. Drug companies began developing substances specifically for athletic enhancement, creating products that pushed the boundaries of existing regulations while providing performance benefits that were difficult to detect through conventional testing methods. These relationships created conflicts of interest that extended throughout the sport's medical and regulatory infrastructure. Doctors who were responsible for player health also had financial interests in companies that produced enhancement products. League officials who were supposed to enforce anti-doping policies had personal relationships with pharmaceutical executives who benefited from lenient enforcement. The expansion of professional football into international markets during this decade created new opportunities for corruption that were even more difficult to monitor and control than domestic activities. Games played in foreign countries operated under different regulatory frameworks that created opportunities for activities that would have been illegal or impossible in the United States. International expansion also provided cover for financial arrangements that might have attracted scrutiny if they had been conducted entirely within American jurisdictions. Team revenues could be generated through foreign subsidiaries that operated under different accounting standards and regulatory requirements, making it easier to obscure the true sources and destinations of various funds. The decade ended with professional football more popular and profitable than ever, but also more thoroughly compromised by forms of corruption that had become virtually invisible to public scrutiny. The sport had learned to operate in an information-rich environment while maintaining systematic deception about its true nature and operations. As the new millennium approached, these patterns of institutional corruption had achieved a kind of technological sophistication that made them almost impossible to detect or challenge through conventional oversight methods. The sport had not merely adapted to the information age. It had learned to exploit its characteristics in service of more effective deception. The shadows had not disappeared in the bright light of technological advancement. They had simply become more precisely controlled, more carefully managed, more thoroughly integrated into the infrastructure of the sport itself. The corruption was no longer hiding in darkness, but operating in plain sight, disguised as innovation and progress. The year 2000 arrived with the weight of prophecy and the gleam of digital promise. But professional football crossed into the new millennium, carrying with it all the accumulated corruptions of the previous century, now refined and systematized into forms so sophisticated that they had become nearly indistinguishable from legitimate business operations. This was the dawn of an era when the sport would discover that the most effective forms of deception were those that operated in plain sight, hiding not in shadows, but in the overwhelming brightness of spectacle and success. The decade began with a scandal that should have served as a wake-up call, but instead became a template for how future corruptions would be normalized and absorbed into the sport's operational structure. The New England Patriots' Spygate controversy, which emerged in 2007, revealed that one of the league's most successful franchises had been systematically cheating for years, filming opposing teams' defensive signals and using that information to gain competitive advantages. But what made Spygate significant was not the fact of the cheating itself. Similar activities had been occurring throughout professional football for decades, but the sophistication of the operation and the league's response to its discovery. The Patriots had developed an elaborate intelligence-gathering system that included not just video surveillance but also complex analytical processes for translating stolen information into tactical advantages. The organization had hired specialists in video analysis and signal interpretation, creating what amounted to a professional espionage operation that operated under the cover of legitimate coaching activities. The cheating was not the work of rogue individuals, but a systematic program that extended throughout the organization and required significant financial investment and coordination. Commissioner Roger Goodell's handling of the Spygate investigation revealed how thoroughly the league had mastered the art of crisis management. The punishment imposed on the Patriots was severe enough to demonstrate the league's commitment to competitive integrity, while being limited enough to avoid uncomfortable questions about how widespread such activities might be throughout professional football. The destruction of evidence that might have revealed the full extent of the Patriots' cheating was presented as a necessary step to move beyond the scandal, but it actually functioned to prevent discoveries that might have implicated other teams or revealed that systematic rule-breaking was a normal part of professional football operations, rather than an aberration to be corrected. The emergence of social media during this period created new challenges and new opportunities for managing public perception of corruption in professional football. Platforms like Twitter and Facebook appeared to democratize information distribution, giving individual voices the ability to challenge official narratives and expose institutional wrongdoing. But social media also created new forms of information pollution that made it easier to overwhelm authentic reporting with manufactured content. Teams and leagues developed sophisticated social media strategies that included not just promotional content, but elaborate disinformation campaigns designed to discredit unfavorable coverage and promote alternative narratives about controversial events. The volume of content produced through social media made it virtually impossible for audiences to distinguish between reliable reporting and sophisticated propaganda. Genuine investigations of corruption could be buried beneath avalanches of promotional material, while serious allegations could be dismissed as rumors or speculation generated by unreliable sources. The concussion crisis that emerged during the late 2000s provided the most revealing window into the sport's institutional approach to inconvenient truths. The mounting evidence that professional football caused systematic brain damage in its participants represented an existential threat to the sport's cultural legitimacy and commercial viability. The NFL's response to the concussion crisis followed a playbook that had been developed through decades of managing other forms of corruption and controversy. Rather than acknowledging the scope of the problem and working to address it comprehensively, the league focused on controlling the flow of information and managing public perception while making minimal changes to actual practices. The league funded its own research into brain injury while simultaneously working to discredit independent scientists who were producing findings that contradicted the NFL's preferred narratives. Team physicians were encouraged to develop treatment protocols that would minimize the apparent severity of head injuries, while allowing players to return to action as quickly as possible. But the concussion crisis also revealed the extent to which systematic deception had become embedded in the sport's medical infrastructure. Team doctors who were supposed to prioritize player health instead functioned as employees whose primary responsibility was to keep players available for competition regardless of the long-term health consequences. The painkiller epidemic that accompanied the concussion crisis represented another form of corruption that operated under the cover of legitimate medical care. Players were provided with powerful prescription drugs that allowed them to continue playing through injuries that should have sidelined them, creating dependencies that persisted long after their playing careers ended. Team medical staffs developed a sophisticated understanding of how various combinations of painkillers, anti-inflammatory drugs, and other substances could be used to manage player availability while maintaining plausible medical justification for their prescription practices. Players became willing participants in pharmaceutical experimentation that prioritized short-term performance over long-term health. The domestic violence scandals that emerged during this decade revealed another dimension of how the sport's culture of violence extended beyond the playing field into personal relationships. The Ray Rice incident, captured on video and broadcast worldwide, provided undeniable evidence of the kind of behavior that had been occurring throughout professional football for decades. But the league's response to domestic violence cases followed the same patterns of selective enforcement and damage control that characterized its approach to other forms of corruption. Individual cases were handled with apparent seriousness, while the systemic issues that created conditions for such behavior were largely ignored. The domestic violence cases also revealed the extent to which teams and leagues were willing to cover up criminal behavior in order to protect their commercial interests. Evidence would be suppressed. Victims would be pressured to recant their allegations, and law enforcement agencies would be influenced to minimize charges or avoid prosecution entirely. The fantasy sports explosion during this period created new forms of corruption that blurred the line between gambling and legitimate entertainment. Daily fantasy sports platforms promoted themselves as games of skill, while operating according to principles that were virtually indistinguishable from traditional gambling operations. These platforms also created new incentives for outcome manipulation that were more subtle than traditional game fixing, but potentially more widespread in their impact. Statistical performance needed to satisfy fantasy participants while maintaining the appearance of authentic competition, requiring forms of game management that influenced individual player statistics without necessarily affecting team outcomes. The emergence of legalized sports betting in several states created additional pressures for controlling game outcomes in ways that would satisfy betting markets while maintaining competitive integrity. The enormous volumes of money wagered on professional football games created financial incentives for manipulation that dwarfed anything the sport had previously experienced. But perhaps most troubling was the discovery that Some of these new forms of corruption were being facilitated by the league itself, through partnerships with gambling companies and fantasy sports platforms. The NFL was not merely tolerating these activities, but actively promoting them while maintaining the fiction that they had no impact on competitive integrity. The decade ended with professional football more popular and profitable than ever, but also more thoroughly compromised by forms of corruption that had become integral to its operation. The sport had learned to generate enormous revenues while accommodating systematic rule-breaking, criminal behavior, and institutional deception that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. As the 2010s began, these patterns of corruption had achieved a kind of technological and institutional sophistication that made them virtually immune to conventional oversight or reform efforts. The sport had not merely adapted to changing social and economic conditions. It had learned to exploit them in service of maintaining power structures that prioritized profit over integrity, entertainment over authenticity, and institutional survival over individual welfare. The shadows had not grown longer or darker. They had been replaced by a form of illumination that made everything visible, while simultaneously making it impossible to see clearly. The corruption was no longer hidden, but had become the foundation upon which the entire enterprise rested, so fundamental to its operation that removing it would require rebuilding the sport from scratch. The 2010s arrived carrying the promise of transparency through technology, but professional football discovered instead that digital omniscience could serve the cause of deception more effectively than any previous tool in the history of organized corruption. This was the decade when the sport learned to operate within a surveillance state of its own creation, where every action was monitored and recorded. Yet the sheer volume of information generated made it easier rather than harder to conceal systematic wrongdoing beneath layers of data and distraction. The decade began with the Bountygate scandal that revealed how thoroughly violence had been commodified within professional football culture. The New Orleans Saints were discovered to have operated a systematic program where players received cash bonuses for injuring opponents, turning what was already a brutal sport into something that more closely resembled gladiatorial combat. But what made Bountygate significant was not the existence of such programs. Similar arrangements had existed throughout professional football for decades, but the discovery of how thoroughly documented the corruption had become. The Saints maintained detailed records of payments, targets, and successful hits, creating an archive of institutional violence that provided undeniable evidence of systematic intent to harm opposing players. The league's response to Bountygate followed familiar patterns of dramatic punishment and damage control. But the digital evidence made it impossible to maintain the usual fictions about isolated incidents and rogue actors. The documentation revealed that bounty programs were not aberrations, but logical extensions of a culture that had always rewarded violence while maintaining plausible deniability about its encouragement. Commissioner Roger Goodell's handling of the crisis demonstrated the sophisticated propaganda techniques that had evolved to manage scandals in the digital age. The punishment imposed on the Saints organization was severe enough to satisfy public demands for accountability, while being limited enough to avoid uncomfortable questions about how widespread such programs might be throughout professional football. But Goodell also understood that the digital age required new forms of narrative management that could operate across multiple platforms simultaneously. The league developed comprehensive communication strategies that included not just traditional media relations, but sophisticated social media campaigns designed to shape public perception through carefully coordinated messaging. The Deflategate controversy that consumed the mid-2010s provided an even more revealing window into how corruption had evolved in the digital age. The allegation that the New England Patriots had deliberately deflated footballs to gain competitive advantages seemed almost trivial compared to earlier scandals, but the investigation revealed the extent to which systematic rule-breaking had become normalized throughout professional football. What made Deflategate significant was not the specific violation alleged, but the institutional response it generated. The NFL commissioned an investigation that cost millions of dollars and produced a report that was simultaneously exhaustive and inconclusive, providing enormous amounts of data while avoiding definitive conclusions about what had actually occurred. The Wells report demonstrated how information could be weaponized in service of predetermined conclusions. The investigation appeared to be thorough and objective, while actually being designed to support the league's need to impose significant punishment without acknowledging the systematic nature of rule-breaking throughout professional football. The Patriots' response to the Deflategate investigation revealed how sophisticated organizations had become at managing digital age scandals. The team deployed armies of lawyers, public relations specialists, and data analysts to challenge every aspect of the league's findings, while simultaneously conducting their own investigation designed to generate alternative narratives about what had occurred. The result was an information war that overwhelmed public understanding, while providing both sides with sufficient evidence to support their preferred versions of events. The abundance of data made it impossible to determine what had actually happened while creating the impression that every aspect of the controversy had been thoroughly examined. But Deflategate also revealed how digital surveillance had transformed the nature of corruption in professional football. The investigation relied heavily on text messages, emails, and cell phone records that provided unprecedented insight into how rule-breaking was planned and executed. The digital age had made systematic deception more difficult to conceal, but also more necessary to survival. Teams began developing more sophisticated operational security protocols designed to avoid creating digital evidence that could be used against them in future investigations. Communications about questionable activities were conducted through channels that were less likely to be monitored or recorded. The technology that promised transparency instead created incentives for more elaborate forms of concealment. The emergence of comprehensive player tracking systems during this period created new opportunities for both performance enhancement and outcome manipulation. Every movement of every player on the field was recorded and analyzed, providing unprecedented insight into athletic performance while creating new opportunities for those who understood how to manipulate data for competitive advantage. The tracking systems generated enormous amounts of information that could be used to identify patterns and tendencies that were invisible to traditional observation methods. Teams that gained access to more sophisticated analytical capabilities could develop strategies that exploited opponent weaknesses with surgical precision. But the same systems that enhanced tactical capabilities also created new vulnerabilities to corruption. Information about player performance and team strategies became commodities that could be traded or stolen for competitive advantage. The digital infrastructure that supported advanced analytics also provided pathways for unauthorized access to sensitive information. The daily fantasy sports explosion during this period created new forms of corruption that operated in the gray areas between gambling and entertainment. Platforms like DraftKings and FanDuel promoted themselves as skill-based competitions while operating according to principles that were virtually indistinguishable from traditional gambling operations. These platforms also created new incentives for outcome manipulation that were more subtle than traditional game fixing, but potentially more widespread in their impact. Individual player performances needed to satisfy fantasy participants while maintaining the appearance of authentic competition, creating pressure for forms of game management that influenced statistical outcomes without necessarily affecting team results. The revelation that employees of fantasy sports companies were using insider information to gain advantages in competitions on rival platforms demonstrated how thoroughly corruption had penetrated these new forms of entertainment. The same individuals who were responsible for maintaining competitive integrity were exploiting their privileged access to information for personal gain. But perhaps most troubling was the discovery that professional football teams and players were developing financial relationships with fantasy sports platforms that created conflicts of interest that extended throughout the sport. Players had incentives to prioritize individual statistical performance over team success, while teams had reasons to manage game outcomes in ways that would satisfy fantasy participants rather than optimize competitive results. The legalization of sports betting in multiple states following a 2018 Supreme Court decision created additional pressures for controlling game outcomes in ways that would satisfy betting markets while maintaining competitive integrity. The enormous volumes of money wagered on professional football games created financial incentives for manipulation that dwarfed anything the sport had previously experienced. The integration of official betting partnerships with professional football represented a fundamental transformation in the sport's relationship with gambling. Rather than maintaining the traditional fiction that betting had no impact on competitive integrity, teams and leagues began actively promoting gambling while claiming that they could maintain appropriate boundaries between commercial relationships and sporting competition. But these partnerships also created new vulnerabilities to corruption, as betting companies gained access to information and influence that could be used to shape game outcomes in ways that benefited their commercial interests. The line between entertainment and manipulation became increasingly difficult to distinguish as financial relationships between sports organizations and gambling companies became more complex and more lucrative. The social media revolution during this decade created new mechanisms for both exposing and concealing corruption in professional football. Platforms like Twitter and Instagram appeared to democratize information distribution, giving individual voices the ability to challenge official narratives and expose institutional wrongdoing. But social media also created new forms of information pollution that made it easier to overwhelm authentic reporting with manufactured content. Teams and leagues developed sophisticated social media strategies that included not just promotional content, but elaborate disinformation campaigns designed to discredit unfavorable coverage and promote alternative narratives about controversial events. The emergence of influencer culture created new opportunities for covert promotion and manipulation of public opinion about corruption scandals. Individuals with large social media followings could be compensated to promote particular viewpoints about controversial events without disclosing their financial relationships with interested parties. The streaming media revolution that emerged during the late 2010s created additional pressures for outcome management as content platforms competed for exclusive access to professional football programming. The need to satisfy streaming audiences while maintaining competitive integrity created new incentives for forms of entertainment enhancement that pushed the boundaries of sporting authenticity. Platform algorithms that determined which content would be promoted or suppressed created new forms of influence that could be exploited by those who understood how to manipulate engagement metrics. Authentic reporting about corruption could be buried beneath promotional material, while manufactured controversies could be amplified to distract attention from more serious scandals. The decade also saw the emergence of more sophisticated forms of performance-enhancing drug use that exploited advances in medical technology and pharmacology. Gene therapy, stem cell treatments, and other cutting-edge medical procedures provided new opportunities for enhancement that were virtually impossible to detect through conventional testing methods. The line between legitimate medical treatment and performance enhancement became increasingly blurred as teams gained access to medical technologies that could optimize player performance while maintaining plausible therapeutic justification. Players became willing participants in experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of human capability while avoiding obvious violations of anti-doping policies. Team medical staffs evolved into sophisticated research and development operations that were more concerned with maximizing player performance than maintaining player health. The pressure to gain competitive advantages through medical innovation created incentives for experimentation that prioritized short-term results over long-term consequences. The concussion crisis that had emerged during the previous decade reached a new level of sophistication during the 2010s, as the league developed more elaborate methods for managing the public health implications of systematic brain damage. Rather than addressing the fundamental problem of repetitive head trauma, the NFL focused on developing technologies and protocols that would minimize the apparent severity of concussion symptoms while allowing players to continue participating. The settlement of concussion-related lawsuits provided a mechanism for compensating former players while avoiding admission of institutional responsibility for their injuries. The financial arrangements were structured to provide the appearance of accountability, while actually limiting the league's exposure to future claims and maintaining the viability of current operations. But the concussion settlements also revealed the extent to which the league was willing to treat player health as a cost of doing business rather than a fundamental responsibility. The calculations underlying the settlement amounts demonstrated that the financial value of maintaining current practices exceeded the costs of compensating players who suffered long-term health consequences. As the decade ended, professional football had achieved a form of institutional sophistication that allowed it to operate with unprecedented transparency, while simultaneously engaging in systematic deception that was more elaborate and more effective than anything that had preceded it. The sport had learned to function within a surveillance state, while maintaining privacy for its most questionable activities, to embrace technological innovation while using it to serve traditional patterns of corruption and exploitation. The digital panopticon that was supposed to make institutional wrongdoing impossible had instead become the most effective tool for concealing it that had ever been devised. The shadows had not been eliminated by the bright light of digital scrutiny. They had been transformed into something more subtle and more pervasive, a form of institutional darkness that operated not in the absence of light, but through its careful management and manipulation. The 2000s arrived like a fever dream, carrying with them the weight of a global pandemic that would strip away pretenses and reveal the true priorities of every institution in American society, including professional football. This was the decade when the sport would discover that artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making could serve the cause of corruption more effectively than any human conspiracy, where machine learning could be trained to optimize deception with a precision and scale that defied traditional understanding. The COVID-19 pandemic created unprecedented challenges for professional football, but it also provided cover for implementing changes that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The suspension of normal operations allowed teams and leagues to experiment with new forms of outcome management that were justified as necessary adaptations to public health requirements, but actually served to advance longer-standing corruption agendas. The empty stadiums and altered playing conditions created opportunities for more sophisticated forms of game manipulation that were less likely to be detected by traditional oversight methods. Without crowds to provide unpredictable acoustic environments, teams could communicate more effectively with players during games, providing real-time strategic adjustments that pushed the boundaries of legal coaching assistance. The increased reliance on technology during pandemic operations also created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who understood how to manipulate digital systems. Video conferencing platforms used for team meetings could be compromised to provide competitors with access to sensitive strategic information. Digital playbooks and analytical systems became targets for sophisticated hacking operations that were virtually impossible to detect or prosecute. But perhaps most significantly, the pandemic provided justification for implementing artificial intelligence systems that could optimize various aspects of football operations while maintaining plausible deniability about their true purposes. These systems were presented as necessary tools for managing the complexities of operating during a global health crisis. But they actually functioned as sophisticated corruption engines designed to maximize competitive advantages while minimizing the risk of detection. The emergence of comprehensive AI-driven analytics during this period represented a fundamental transformation in how corruption could be implemented and concealed. Rather than relying on human conspirators who might be detected or compromised, organizations could now delegate questionable decision-making to algorithmic systems that operated according to parameters that were too complex for external oversight to understand or evaluate. These AI systems could analyze enormous amounts of data to identify optimal strategies for rule bending that were virtually impossible to detect through conventional monitoring methods. They could calculate the precise probability of various violations being discovered and punished, allowing organizations to engage in systematic cheating while maintaining statistically acceptable levels of plausible deniability. The integration of AI into officiating systems created additional opportunities for sophisticated outcome manipulation. Computer-assisted review systems that were supposed to improve the accuracy of calls could be programmed with subtle biases that influenced game outcomes in ways that were too small to be noticed individually, but significant in their cumulative effect. The algorithms that determined when reviews would be conducted and how they would be evaluated could be designed to favor certain teams, or to ensure that games remained competitive, regardless of the apparent talent differential between participants. The technology that promised to eliminate human error in officiating instead created new opportunities for systematic manipulation that was more sophisticated and more difficult to detect than anything that had preceded it. The legalization of sports betting in most states created enormous new revenue streams for professional football, but it also created unprecedented pressure for controlling game outcomes in ways that would satisfy betting markets while maintaining the appearance of competitive integrity. The volumes of money involved in legal sports wagering created financial incentives for corruption that dwarfed anything the sport had previously experienced. But the most troubling aspect of this transformation was the discovery that artificial intelligence systems were being used to optimize betting market manipulation in real time. Sophisticated algorithms could monitor betting patterns and adjust game conditions to ensure that outcomes would maximize revenue for gambling operators while maintaining plausible competitive legitimacy. These systems could calculate the optimal timing for penalty calls, injury timeouts, and other game interruptions that would influence betting outcomes without obviously predetermining game results. They could manage the flow of information to betting markets to create artificial volatility that would generate additional revenue for gambling operators while maintaining the fiction of unpredictable competition. The emergence of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology created new opportunities for concealing financial transactions related to corruption in professional football. Digital currencies allowed for payments that were difficult to trace through traditional banking systems, while smart contracts could automate complex corruption schemes without requiring human intermediaries who might be detected or compromised. Teams and leagues began experimenting with blockchain-based systems for managing various operational functions. But these same technologies provided pathways for activities that would have been impossible to conceal through traditional financial mechanisms. Payments to players, officials, or other participants could be disguised as legitimate blockchain transactions that were technically legal but ethically questionable. The non-fungible token (NFT) craze that emerged during this period created additional opportunities for money laundering and influence trading that operated under the cover of legitimate digital collectibles markets. High-value NFT transactions could be used to transfer significant sums of money for questionable purposes while maintaining the appearance of normal commercial activity. The streaming media revolution that had begun during the previous decade reached full maturity during the 2020s, creating new pressures for outcome management as content platforms competed for exclusive access to professional football programming. The algorithms that determined which content would be promoted or suppressed on streaming platforms created new forms of influence that could be exploited by those who understood how to manipulate engagement metrics. But streaming platforms also created new vulnerabilities to corruption, as they gained access to real-time viewership data that could be used to influence game outcomes in ways that would maximize audience engagement and advertising revenue. Platforms could provide feedback to broadcasters and potentially to teams about which types of plays and outcomes were generating the most viewer interest, creating incentives for managing competition to satisfy algorithmic rather than sporting imperatives. The emergence of virtual and augmented reality technologies created additional opportunities for enhancing the entertainment value of professional football while potentially compromising competitive integrity. These technologies allowed for the creation of immersive experiences that could be more compelling than actual games, reducing the importance of authentic competition while increasing the emphasis on controllable spectacle. VR and AR systems could also be used to provide enhanced training and preparation tools that gave certain teams significant competitive advantages over opponents who lacked access to similar technologies. The digital divide in professional football became a new source of inequality that could be exploited by organizations with superior technological resources. The social media landscape during this decade became increasingly dominated by algorithmic content curation that could be manipulated to control public perception of corruption scandals. Rather than relying on traditional media gatekeepers to manage information flow, teams and leagues could now influence what information reached public attention through sophisticated manipulation of social media algorithms. These manipulation techniques became so sophisticated that they could create the appearance of organic public opinion, while actually representing coordinated propaganda campaigns designed to support particular narratives about controversial events. Artificial intelligence systems could generate enormous volumes of apparently authentic social media content that would overwhelm genuine reporting about corruption scandals. The development of deepfake technology created new possibilities for both exposing and concealing corruption in professional football. While these technologies could potentially be used to create false evidence of wrongdoing, they also provided plausible deniability for authentic evidence by allowing anyone accused of corruption to claim that incriminating materials had been artificially generated. The uncertainty created by deepfake technology made it increasingly difficult for the public to distinguish between authentic and manufactured evidence, creating an environment where truth became subordinate to narrative management and technological sophistication. The most effective forms of corruption became those that operated in the gray areas where authentic and artificial evidence could not be distinguished. The decade also saw the emergence of quantum computing technologies that promised to revolutionize data analysis and encryption, but also created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sophisticated corruption operations. Quantum systems could potentially break the encryption protecting sensitive communications and financial transactions, while quantum-enhanced AI could optimize corruption schemes with unprecedented precision and scope. But perhaps most troubling was the discovery that some organizations were developing quantum-resistant corruption techniques designed to operate effectively even in an environment where traditional cryptographic protections had been compromised. These systems represented a new generation of institutional deception that was designed to remain effective regardless of future technological developments. As the decade progressed, professional football achieved a form of technological sophistication that allowed it to engage in systematic corruption that was virtually indistinguishable from legitimate business operations. The sport had learned to exploit artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, and algorithmic decision-making in service of traditional patterns of deception and exploitation, but with a precision and scale that defied conventional understanding. The corruption had evolved beyond human comprehension and control, operating through technological systems that were too complex for any individual or organization to fully understand or oversight to effectively monitor. The shadows had not been eliminated by technological advancement. They had been transformed into something that operated through the technology itself, a form of institutional darkness that was embedded in the very systems that were supposed to provide illumination and accountability. As we approach the present moment, professional football exists in a state of technological contradiction, where unprecedented transparency coexists with unprecedented opacity, where every action is monitored and recorded, while the most significant forms of corruption operate through systems that are too sophisticated to be detected or understood by conventional oversight methods. The sport has achieved a form of algorithmic perfection in its deception that represents the culmination of more than a century of institutional evolution in service of moral compromise and commercial exploitation. And so we arrive at this moment, standing at the edge of today with the weight of all these accumulated shadows pressing against our understanding of what American football has become. The year is 2025, and the game continues to roll forward like some magnificent, terrible machine that generates both transcendent beauty and systematic corruption with equal efficiency, equal inevitability. Here, in this present moment, we can see how all the threads we have followed, the gambling, the violence, the pharmaceutical enhancement, the institutional deception, have woven themselves into something that is simultaneously more sophisticated and more primitive than anything that came before. The sport has achieved a kind of technological perfection in its capacity for corruption, while remaining fundamentally rooted in the same human weaknesses and institutional failures that have characterized it since its earliest days. The stadiums still fill on Sundays with families seeking communion through shared spectacle, their faces painted in team colors that represent loyalties deeper than reason, more persistent than evidence. The children still wear jerseys bearing the names of heroes whose heroism exists primarily in carefully constructed mythologies, designed to obscure more complex truths about the nature of professional sport in late-stage capitalism. But underneath this familiar surface, algorithmic systems are optimizing outcomes in real time, adjusting the probability of various events to ensure maximum entertainment value and commercial return. Artificial intelligence monitors every heartbeat, every muscle twitch, every micro-expression of every participant, calculating optimal strategies for influence and manipulation that operate below the threshold of human perception. The corruption has become so sophisticated that it no longer requires conscious participation from most of those involved in its implementation. Players train and compete with genuine dedication and authentic effort, unaware that their performances are being subtly modified by systems they cannot see or understand. Coaches develop strategies based on data that has been carefully curated to support predetermined narratives about competitive balance and entertaining outcomes. Officials make calls that feel authentic and appropriate to them, while operating within parameters that have been algorithmically optimized to ensure that games remain competitive and dramatically satisfying regardless of the actual talent differential between teams. The human element that was supposed to be preserved within technological advancement has instead been co-opted by it, becoming another variable to be managed rather than a source of authentic unpredictability. The betting markets that now openly operate as partners with professional football have created a form of financial surveillance that monitors every aspect of the sport, while simultaneously creating incentives for manipulation that are more powerful than any previous form of corruption. The line between entertainment and gambling has been erased not through dramatic policy changes, but through gradual normalization of relationships that would have been scandalous in previous eras. But perhaps most troubling is the realization that this system operates with the tacit consent of audiences who understand, at some level, that what they are watching is not pure competition but managed spectacle, yet continue to participate because the entertainment value remains high, and the emotional satisfaction continues to be delivered on schedule. The corruption has evolved beyond the need for secrecy because it has achieved something more valuable: acceptance. The systematic manipulation of outcomes, the pharmaceutical enhancement of performance, the institutional prioritization of profit over player welfare. All of these have become normalized aspects of how professional football operates rather than scandals to be hidden or reformed. We have learned to love the sport despite its corruption, or perhaps because of it. The knowledge that games might be subtly manipulated to ensure dramatic conclusions does not diminish their entertainment value, but might actually enhance it by guaranteeing the emotional satisfaction that audiences crave. The understanding that players are risking their long-term health for our entertainment does not reduce our enthusiasm, but adds an element of gravity and sacrifice that makes victory more meaningful and defeat more poignant. This is the final corruption, the corruption of our own moral imagination, our willingness to accept institutional deception as long as it continues to provide the experiences we desire. We have become complicit in the system not through active participation, but through passive consumption, through our continued willingness to invest our emotions and resources in something we know to be fundamentally compromised. And yet, even in acknowledging this complicity, we must recognize that the human need for shared ritual, for collective meaning-making, for the temporary transcendence that comes through identification with something larger than ourselves. These needs are not corrupted, even when the institutions that serve them are. The joy of watching a perfectly executed play, the communal celebration of victory, the shared agony of defeat. These experiences retain their authenticity, even when they occur within systems designed to manufacture rather than discover them. Perhaps this is the most profound lesson of football's dark history, that human beings are capable of finding genuine meaning and authentic community, even within institutions that are systematically designed to exploit those very human needs for commercial purposes. The corruption of the system does not necessarily corrupt the experience of those who participate in it, just as the manipulation of outcomes does not eliminate the real emotions generated by those outcomes. We are left, then, with a choice that is both simple and impossibly complex. We can continue to participate in this system with full knowledge of its corrupted nature, finding value in the experiences it provides while remaining aware of the costs it extracts. Or we can reject it entirely, walking away from something that provides genuine pleasure and community because we cannot reconcile ourselves to its institutional compromises. But there is perhaps a third option. We can participate consciously, with full awareness of what we are supporting and what we are enabling, while working to create alternative forms of sporting community that might serve the same human needs without requiring the same moral compromises. We can love the game while hating the system, honor the players while condemning the institutions that exploit them, celebrate the moments of transcendence while acknowledging the machinery of corruption that surrounds them. The shadows have grown so long that they now cover everything. But within those shadows, human beings continue to seek light, continue to create meaning, continue to find ways to connect with each other through shared experience and common purpose. The corruption is real and systematic and profound, but it is not total. It has not eliminated the possibility of authentic human connection, only made it more difficult to achieve and more precious when it occurs. And so the game continues, carrying within itself all the contradictions and compromises that have defined it throughout its history, generating both beauty and ugliness with equal facility, creating both community and exploitation with the same fundamental mechanisms. We watch and participate and hope and despair, knowing that we are complicit in something larger and more complex than our individual moral calculations can fully comprehend. The field grows dark as the lights fade, but somewhere in that darkness, young men are still learning to throw perfect spirals, still discovering satisfaction of perfectly executed teamwork, still experiencing the transformative power of pushing themselves beyond their perceived limitations. The corruption is vast and systematic and probably irreversible, but it has not eliminated these smaller truths, these individual moments of genuine accomplishment and authentic connection. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all we can ask of any human institution. Not that it be perfect, but that it continue to provide spaces where perfection remains possible, even if only in glimpses, even if only temporarily, even if only within systems that are themselves fundamentally flawed. The shadows are long and deep, but they have not eliminated the light entirely. It still exists, filtered and refracted, and often difficult to see clearly, but still present for those who know how to look for it. And in the end, perhaps that is the real story of American football. Not the corruption that has come to define its institutions, but the persistent human capacity to find meaning and beauty and connection even within the darkness, even despite the darkness, even because the darkness makes the moments of illumination all the more precious and all the more necessary. The game ends, but the game also continues. The corruption persists, but so does the possibility of transcendence. We are left to make our choices and live with their consequences, knowing that there are no perfect options, only different ways of navigating the complex moral landscape that professional football has become. In that navigation, in that ongoing choice about how to relate to something we love despite its flaws, we perhaps discover something essential about ourselves and about the nature of moral life in a compromised world. The shadows are long, but they are not eternal. The light persists, even when we cannot see it clearly. And somewhere, always, the game continues.